I was talking to Ted before we started and I was surprised that he didn't come away with what I call one of his Fletcherisms. He's generally got some lovely little stories, Ted, but he was quite serious today and rightly so, talking about failures on aircraft. One little joke I heard the other day, just to start off with, was at the end of a long turbulent flight, everybody was tired, the grog had cut out, the food was poor, and everybody was getting quite irritable. And one of the junior cabin staff came to the senior one and said, "I've got a gentleman up front that's making a lot of noise and he's very unhappy." She went up and spoke to the gentleman and said, "What's the problem, sir?" And he said, "Well, I've flown on this airline for years. I generally get the same seat. I can't see the TV or the movie. I want to go to sleep, but I've got no blinds on my window." And she said, "For heaven's sake, Captain, land the aircraft and we'll all get some sleep." It's a typical Ted one. Firstly, I wish to go on record to thank Brian Hernan for the invaluable work he does in helping to prepare these talks. He spent a lot of time with me on this one, and I'm sure he spends a lot of time with nearly everybody in preparing these presentations. So if you all enjoy the show today, thank Brian, and if you don't, blame Brian. That lets me off. Our past talks, we've heard about Lancasters, Spitfires, Mitchells, Bostons, Catalinas and a lot more, the aircraft of yesteryear. Unfortunately, most have gone. There's a few left in museums, and there's even fewer still flying. But it's a bit different here today, because if you look outside on the tarmac, and I got permission to park a little Jeep out there, you'll see a 1944 Willys Jeep, which is mine. It's fully operational and it's ready to go. Afterwards, if you're interested, perhaps you might like to have a look downstairs a little bit closer at it and then ask whatever questions that you like. I brought a few little pieces along just to demonstrate before I start the talk, and so I think I'll go into that right now. Where does one get parts to restore a vehicle like that? It's not as hard as one would think, because left over from World War II are a lot of parts that are still sealed in boxes, I think in a beeswax. It's called tropical pack, and anyone that's had anything to do with aeroplanes would remember the same type of material. This is I think part out of the generator. This part here is part of a tail light and was made in the 1940s, and it's never been unpacked. If you want to have a closer look afterwards, by all means have a look and just see how they preserved them. It's wonderful to find something over 60 years old preserved and basically brand new. Here is a radiator cap that I only took out of its pack quite recently and put the old one back in, so you can see what is inside the actual package itself. And looking at this, but this was the original cap that I restored the vehicle with about 30 odd years ago. Now the Jeep also had an instruction in one of the many books that I've read about how to destroy it in the event of capture. And on the side of the Jeep you'll see an axe and a shovel. The instruction was something like this: in the event of capture, remove the axe from the side of the vehicle. Naturally, if time permits, I wouldn't be too happy if the enemy's about 20 metres away, but this was the instruction. Remove the axe, undo the hood, which is what the Americans call the bonnet, or what we call the bonnet. Smash the carburettor, the distributor, the battery, the generator, the voltage regulator, and under the driver's seat is the petrol tank. And this is a spare petrol cap of a standard Jeep. Then it says, and don't go running out of here because it's been made safe, this is a standard hand grenade. The instruction then went on to say, remove the pin from a Mark IV hand grenade, place it in the petrol tank and vacate the area. So if you want to have a look at a real hand grenade, here is one. It's not alive, I can assure you, but I went to great elaborate movements this morning when I brought the Jeep along, not to take it airside, but it would just be wonderful trying to explain to Commonwealth Police what I'm doing with a hand grenade. So it's up here for all to have a look at. The Jeep is now, the current Jeep, is now just about all plastic. Here's a hubcap of one, and a totally different scheme to what they were in the one that's outside. Over there is a cross member of a Jeep, one that was completely beyond help for restoring, and there's a metal plate on the top, which is a plate where a machine gun was mounted. So there wouldn't be too many vehicles running around today that have a plate underneath where a machine gun could be mounted. It's a wonder that the traffic authorities of today don't object to that, but it's part of the vehicle, and there it is. There's also a jerry can, an original jerry can, marked on G for gasoline, and under that it's got QMC. That represents the Quartermaster Corps of America, because bear in mind the whole Jeep is American manufacture. On the chair behind is the grille from a Jeep, and on one side there's a headlight. Afterwards, if you'd like to have a closer look, you can see that both headlights, and I've only got the one there for demonstration, hinge up and backwards into the engine bay, which is used as a trouble light, or if you're doing servicing in the night somewhere. So you just swivel the headlights up back into the engine bay, and you haven't got to play around with torches and things like that. So simple and yet so effective. Even on the maintenance part of it, the sump plug is on the side of the sump, not underneath as a normal car. And if it required an oil change in the field, the idea was for the 3 men, or 4 I think, could roll the Jeep on its side. The sump plug was then pointing down to the ground, and all the grease nipples are all angled in such a way that from walking at the side of the Jeep, not under it, you can do a grease up in about 2 minutes and then boot it back on its wheels, having put the plug back in the sump, fill it up with oil, and away you go. So quite innovative for its day, because they were put together in quite a hurry. So we'll get on with the story of the Jeep. One of the first things that I remember finding out about years ago, that if you're talking about any subject, doesn't matter what it is, aeroplanes, Jeeps, whatever, it's not a bad idea to look at a dictionary definition of what it is you're talking about. And on the World Book Dictionary of 1973, it states the Jeep is a small but powerful general purpose vehicle of 4-wheel drive. The general purpose we'll talk about later. It was originally designed for the US Army and holds a 1/4 ton of weight. Most of you would have heard of the saying, Jeepers Creepers. Well, according to the same dictionary, this was a statement made by a certain Major General George Lynch, who was then the Chief of Infantry of the US Army, upon the occasion of his first ride in a prototype model of the vehicle at Fort Myer in Virginia. He was overheard to have said to some people standing nearby, Jeepers Creepers, we've got to get some of these. And so that might have been the start of the name, but really no one quite knows. I'll dwell on the name of Jeep for a start, because my subsequent reading on the subject has convinced me that history really doesn't know for sure how the name came about, and we may never know, so I invite you all to form your own opinions. For my part, I simply make the statement that although I'm the proud owner of a 1944 Willys Jeep, found as a wreck at a farm in Carew nearly 30 years ago, I researched far and wide, took 3 years to restore it, but I've enjoyed driving it in many functions for all 3 armed services. Private events, carrying kids from Camp Quality, to providing transport for our Governor-General, who was then the Governor of WA, Major General Michael Jeffrey. And he enjoyed it immensely, because in his young days as a soldier, the Jeep was then the in-vehicle. Further research showed that I really didn't know very much about the vehicle's concept, planning and design, and finally production. So how did the name Jeep come about? Originally, they were called 1/4 ton 4x4 trucks. Over there is an original book, 1944 book, and that's what they were officially called. Not Jeep, that was the classification by the military. Unfortunately, a great deal of speculation and misinformation about Jeeps has been published, and therefore it's gained credibility. This has obscured and altered the facts. The American Army in the 1930s were becoming more and more mobile, and if nothing else, the United States government must have been watching the growth of the German Army, and it would have been clear to the planners of the day that the cavalry, that is horses, were for ceremonial use only, and would be of little use in a modern war that the world was heading for in the 1940s. We'll go up to some other slides now. There's an early concept of what the Jeep really is. The machine gun, about the same position as where the Jeep was, or Jeep used to be. And it's a T-model Ford. Everybody's heard of a T-model Ford, and like it or not, and another American invention. Okay, next one. The original company was not Willys or Ford, but I'll go into that. The specification was eventually put out by the Quartermaster Corps, QMC, again on the jerrycan, to produce a four-wheel drive vehicle reconnaissance with a maximum weight of 1,300 pounds on the old measurements. And the major car companies were given a month to come up with a design for a prototype. 3 car builders showed interest: Willys Overland, Ford, and the Bantam Car Company, which was an offshoot of Austin of England. Bantam obtained the services of a brilliant 56-year-old engineer by the name of Karl Provost, almost sounds of German ancestry, and within 3 days of working 18-hour shifts, he designed the vehicle, which for the purpose of description we'll call the Jeep. That's not what it was called then, because Bantam, when they went into production, classified their first batch as Model 40 BRC, which meant Bantam Reconnaissance Command. Willys and Ford submitted designs, but only Willys and Bantam estimated production costs for the vehicle. The contract went to Bantam, and so a small company on the brink of extinction takes on, as it were, the big boys. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But the trouble is, reality is not a fairy tale, as you'll see in this case. However, the first problem was the weight restriction, as the vehicle was to be used on very rough off-road conditions, and you will see later on the slides it simply would be not strong enough, and the weight rose above the original estimate. And so the very first Jeep arrived at the testing ground called Camp Hollibird at 4:30 p.m, 23rd of September 1940, having finally completed early that same morning and driven 200 miles from the Bantam factory to the testing ground. Now imagine that happening today. The poor little vehicle was driven to breaking point and was described as the best vehicle ever tested at that area, and the company was given the go-ahead to build the rest of the 70 prototypes with some modification. Before that was completed, the military were keen enough to place an order for 1,500 vehicles. Both Ford and Willys observers were at the Hollibird trials and were making notes as fast as their pens could write. With the testing of the Bantam handed to the Army, this meant the design of the vehicle belonged to the military, and the unique blueprints were copied and given to Willys and Ford. One could certainly question the ethics of such action, but there was concern that with large orders that would be coming up, that the Bantam Car Company could not cope. So the night of the long knives had begun. By November 1940, both Willys and Ford had produced prototypes. That's the prototype of the Bantam, and the very first one that was made, which you can see is nothing like the final Jeep. Willys on the 11th, which they called the Quad, and Ford 12 days later, which they called the Pygmy. Can you imagine how the Bantam observers would have felt seeing their design being now used to gain further orders expected to follow? Both of these vehicles were tested, but it became clear that the weight would have to increase to 2,160 pounds to all vehicles. The other interesting discovery was that the Willys engine from the Willys Whitman car, called the Go Devil, was the best of all 3 vehicles. It then transpired that all 3 vehicles had to undergo a weight loss, and this required a different chassis of alloy steel, and every bolt and washer was evaluated and downsized where necessary. Even the paint was reduced to 1 coat, saving 9 pounds in weight, because they didn't really think they'd get to rust. Their operational life was expected to be no more than 5 months. So that little girl out there has certainly got further than that. Further testing showed that the Willys was the best option, as the Bantam could not match the power of the Willys engine. The Ford engine also failed, as it was basically a tractor engine which owed its origin to the Model A Ford of the late 20s and early 30s, so it was a decade behind the times. At stake was now an order for 16,000 units at a price that both Bantam and Willys needed, and Ford would find it easy to deliver. The Quartermaster Corps favoured Ford, but in the trials the Ford Pygmy came last. On July the 23rd, 1941, Willys was given a contract to supply the 16,000 revised units at a price of $739 each. The first models produced by Willys were the MA. From then on to the end of 1945, they were then known as the MB, which is what that example is today, parked out on the tarmac. Ford may have lost this battle to supply the Jeep, but certainly had not lost the war. On the 10th of November 1941, Ford agreed to make the vehicle, which was to be called the Jeep, and remarkably, and probably the only time in the life of the Ford Motor Company, they agreed to make this vehicle to the Willys specification and plans, which of course were originally Bantams. And so Ford made a replica of the Willys, including the Go Devil engine, and Ford called their Jeep the GPW. Further research on this has shown that the GP in Ford Jeep does not stand for general purpose, as many think, but in the Ford numbering system of that time, G stands for a government contract, any government contract. P means any vehicle made by Ford with an 80-inch wheelbase, and the W is for Willys pattern. They probably put that on in case it failed. Then you could say, don't blame us, blame Willys. The total production figures recorded, and it seems to vary a bit, but it seems to be a figure of around 646,064 vehicles. Bantam finished up during the rest of the war making trailers and aircraft landing gear. After the war, the company did go broke and was incorporated into a large group called American Rolling Mills in 1956. So much for fairy tales. The big boys had won the war of supply. There are some other possible sources of the name Jeep. As it was originally designed as a reconnaissance car, the name Peep was used for a while, like look over a hill or rising ground and have a quick peep. It didn't stay for long because it sounds too corny. Perhaps Ford should be considered the originator by calling their pygmy the GPW. As we've discovered, Ford did not regard the vehicle as general purpose, and indeed a truck is more of a general purpose carrier than what a quarter-tonne capacity vehicle would be. The early spelling and official record shows it as the GEEP. And pronouncing the two letters GP really does sound like Jeep. One fact is sure, Willys Overland registered the name Jeep as a trademark. Another theory that I like is the Popeye cartoon of the 30s and 40s. Popeye had a little dog that could go anywhere or do anything, and this little mutt was called Eugene the Jeep. In fact, Ford built a small four-wheel drive military vehicle during the Vietnam period, and that was called the Mutt, which I believe was a bit of a disaster anyway. The Army Museum in Lawton Watercart, which is down in Fremantle in the World War I gallery, has a connection to the Australian version of the Jeep. Freighter Industries took over the Lawton Company sometime in the 1950s, and they designed and built two four-wheel drive prototypes, the idea being initiated by Mr. Noel Peel, and this vehicle was to be called a Leap, L-E-E-P. That was either the Lawton Jeep or Peel's name reversed. One has survived at the South Australian Military Vehicle Museum near Port Adelaide. The concept went no further. So by the late 1941 into early 1942, the Jeep went to war with his big brother, the four-wheel drive, three-quarter-tonne Dodge weapon carrier built by Chrysler Motor Company. Keep that fact in mind as we progress. When the Jeep reached the using arms of the field, the success was instant and sensational. All over the world, it won the admiration of everyone for the manner in which it performed. There's the Jeepers Creepers, I think, at that time, and if anyone's been to Washington, they are the steps leading up to Washington DC Parliament, we'll call it, and it was a bit of a joke when it first showed up, but when it was able to go right up those steps, and there's quite a few, it would have to impress anybody, because at that stage there's no vehicle could have done that. There's the improved Bantam, which is totally different from the first one. Now it's starting to have the lights embedded into the grille and all the rest of it, but nothing approaching the final version. And the next one, Brian. There's an early version of the Willys Quad, which is similar but different in many ways. And the next one. We're starting to get to the testing phase. Now, I can assure you driving over roads like that would be really, really rough. And so we're progressing with the design and the way it's going. It turned out that neither sand, snow, mud or anything else would hold terrors for this little quarter-tonne blitz buggy. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Oh, that's the Ford in profile, which is getting fairly close, and there it is in its final development. Now we'll go into the next shot, and that will show one starting to get used in muddy conditions. And going on from there again, now not only therefore now is it been on the land, it's now not so much on top of the water, but certainly under the water, and it could be driven fully submerged with a snorkel, which you can see on the side of it there. Not a lot of vehicles can do that. There are some modern four-wheel drives that are snorkeled, but they're so heavy that quite often they get bogged in the soft ground in the water. So the Jeep is a submarine. It could achieve 60 miles an hour on highways or claw its way up a grade of 60 degrees in low gear. It was low profile and could tow anti-tank guns and any other sort of gun and trailers. It was fitted with flange wheels instead of tyres and used on railway tracks hauling rolling stock in lieu of a shunting engine. Probably the next one might show that. No, that's the SAS using theirs in the desert, where they'd storm into airports and cause a lot of trouble. They're also used on the other end of war, that is to say bringing out the casualties, and the next one I think is the rail car. I don't know with its standard brakes how you'd ever stop a line of trucks behind you, but for a quick fix to allow some transportation of equipment or personnel, that'll be one way of doing it. So they quickly converted it to rail, and you see that type of thing today. I've been watching them while they're doing the Mandurah line. There's vehicles that have got rails, got wheels on them and they go on the rails. And I hear people saying, oh, that's a new idea. No, it's not. It was used during the war. They even got used in snow. I think the next shot might show that. And they've got a special sort of a wheel where they could just plough through snow without any trouble at all. One war correspondent eulogised the Jeep as follows: "Good Lord, I do not think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes anywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for and still keeps going. It doesn't even ride so badly after you get used to it. The Jeep is a divine instrument of wartime locomotion." That's a little bit over the top, but anyway. I'll leave it at that, except credit General Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces in Europe, when he stated, "The Jeep, the Dakota and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war." The Ford Motor Company went on to make an Amphibious Jeep, and this joined forces with a boat building firm of Sparkman and Stevens, and this became known as, wait for it, the Seep, because it used to leak like a sieve apparently. We'll put that one on next. No, Brian found this one, it rather amused him. Soldiers have to wash in the field if they're going to keep smart in appearance, and here's one being used as driving a washing machine. I think the next one is the one, that's the one, there's the Ford Amphibious Jeep, and it was supposed to be sea-going, but it didn't attempt long sea journeys in its military role. One followed after the war, where it still can be seen out there at the college at Guildford. And it's out on the back in a shed there, driven by some fellow, but highly modified. It was not all that successful, although it was used a fair amount. 12,778 units were made before production ceased in June 43. Jeeps were modified in England by Nuffield, and they were made shorter by cutting out the rear seat, bumpers and anything else could be removed. And these were to be called para-jeeps, to be carried in gliders. Can we see that one? A little two-wheeler. And as gliders developed and got bigger, they then put the standard Jeep in the gliders, and so they actually did get some into the air that way. Now, some Jeeps were covered in armour plating, as the original design was called soft-skinned, but this proved to be unwieldy in service because of the added weight. Many other one or two ops were made, but the real oddball Jeep that really captures my imagination is called a rotor buggy. Now, this really, when I came across this really sort of took a lot of research, but and Brian's even got some new research that I'll get him to talk about in a moment. This comprised of a standard Jeep, just like the one outside there now, with a set of rotary blades and a fuselage bolted onto the rear of the body with twin rudders. It was first towed behind a Bentley motor car, where it became airborne, but landing the unit was difficult. However, it got worse. On September the 11th, 1944, the modified Jeep was towed airborne by a Whitley bomber. Now, some of you people may remember seeing Whitley bombers, twin engine. I think they were obsolete just about at the start of the war. Rose to a height of 700 feet and completed a full circuit of the aerodrome. The landing was made and towed. Now, can you imagine that, pilots? Can you just imagine that? And both pilots, we'll call the fellow in the Jeep a pilot, were nervous wrecks, including the one in the aeroplane. So ended the project, but perhaps with today's technology, the idea could be made to work. Just imagine a bunch of Jeeps arriving in a drop zone, descending at night in what could be an auto rotation, made without very little or perhaps no noise at all, link up with a group of paratroopers who could quickly unbolt the tails and rotor blades, and at a set time all start the engines and become mobile immediately. It'd be a serious concern to the enemy or the defenders indeed. Brian has found some more research on one that was experimented with in Australia. So Brian, would you like to come up and just give us that?
After Frank and I had been talking about this discussion for today, I went through some papers I had at home, some important documents. My wife calls it junk, but they're important documents. And I found a transcription of a paper, transcription of a talk by a bloke called Bob Ridley. Does anyone recall Bob Ridley from the department? Yep, some people do. Bob was involved, he started his career in the Royal Air Force in 1928, came to Australia before World War II and worked for the Department of Civil Aviation. And he must have given a talk somewhere along the way, and this is a, sorry, I'll get some papers, from a tape, I would take it. Also at the time, but extremely hush-hush, was a project under the direction of John Watkins, who was our senior aeronautical engineer. We're engaged on behalf of the Army Inventions Board to engineer a flying Jeep. It came about because someone talked to the Army Inventions Board and said, look, we're dropping 25-pounder gun parts in the clearings in the islands, and we put them together, but they get bogged. We want Jeeps. So I think it was mainly John Watson's idea to attach rotor blades to the Jeep and tow it by air. In our engineering division in head office was a secret section where the development was done by Peter Langford and Iko Tannenbaum under John Watkins. They were designing things and sending them down to Essendon. It was my job to go around to the people who made the parts and collect them and put them together. What was done, a pylon was put onto the Jeep to carry the three-bladed rotor, a false nose was put in the front, and the tail was put out the back with an elevator control, and the design was based on an auto gyro. Now, George Lewis, not the George Lewis from used to be in Kalgoorlie, another George Lewis, had an auto gyro at the time, so he bought his. But the gyro blades were 2 feet too short to carry the Jeep, so John designed an extension of the blades, put on an extra 2 feet, and we did the testing. The pilot was Ken Fruin, who was attached to the Army Inventions Board. He was the pilot for the exercise. So I fitted the blades, tuned them up, and Fruin went on a circuit around Essendon with these extra blades. He came back with his knuckles all skinned. The vibration was dreadful. But we had the idea of attaching it to a C-47. So off to Point Cook we went with elaborate towing ropes made of nylon. We tried the auto gyro out and it did pretty well, and then it goes on to say then the job was killed. We left the bits in Essendon in 1944. I moved on to South Australia, and last seen the bits were hanging in the roof of a shed. So Bob Ridley could have told us another story about this flying Jeep if we'd have got to him 10 years ago. I think he passed away about 10 years ago. Anyway, that's out of my important collection of documents at home.
Not rubbish.
This one, which is a bit different to that one. There's another one I think, Brian, isn't it? That's it. That's the Australian version that we can make out. And there's some differences, like a nose cone looks different. But it's just amazing what people do when they set their mind to it. So the Jeep, ladies and gentlemen, has been on both land, sea and air, which is probably not too many vehicles can match that. So having been a former pilot, I am aware that it's a 3-name call sign, like, Alpha Bravo Charlie. But any of today's pilots, or particularly helicopter pilots, if ever you hear the call sign Juliet Echo Echo Papa clear to land, get out of the way quick. Try and look at it from ground side, not on your side. But it did happen because they were desperate days with intelligent people working to improve it. Okay, by the end of the war, Ford, having fought so hard to get in the action to build Jeeps, dropped the idea and ceased production. Bantam, as mentioned earlier, went bankrupt. Willys continued for many years, making a very similar shape and size vehicle called the CJ series. And would you believe that means civilian Jeep? It seems too easy. And they were very popular for quite some time. Eventually, Willys was absorbed into a larger company called American Motors Corporation, AMC, and then we saw names like Golden Eagle, Renegade and Cherokee, still bearing the proud name of Jeep. Also after the war, the Rotor Company of England could see that what the Jeep had done in the British forces and copied the Jeep in many ways, both in size and shape, producing what is known still today as the Land Rover. It had at least 2 good refinements. It had doors with enclosed sides and more comfortable seats. The Japanese followed with the Toyota Land Cruiser and the Nissan Patrol. The Russians actually started making their own Jeep in 1943 until the 1950s, and this was called the Gaz 67B, based on a design by an engineer by the name of Vitaly Gorechev, and its origin was based on an A-model Ford of the late 1920s and 30s. The engine, axles, front grille and even instrument panel were purely Model A Ford in appearance. And incidentally, most of the 1500 BRCs by Bantam were sent to Russia. The French military adapted a unique way of getting their post-war army into Jeeps or something similar. Scattered over France, it was found that approximately 10,000 Jeeps remained, all in different states of repair. Additionally, there were many other captured German and Italian vehicles, so there was a vast sorting operation carried out. Initially, it was decided to gather, strip and rebuild the original Jeep. The starter motor in my Jeep was a rebuilt unit that came out of France. It has been rewound and completely rebuilt and is one of the best starters of our group, in our group of enthusiasts. The French motor industry, Peugeot and Citroën, submitted designs of all types to the military, but they were too complicated, and in the end, which was the beginning, the French military replaced the Jeep with the Jeep, which was a deal between Willys Overland and the Hotchkiss Company in France, and in 1952 the Jeep came out, changed from the MB, and it was called the Model M201, with a 24-volt electrical system, the same as aircraft, in view of the original 6-volt system, and this continued until 1966. Over 27,000 vehicles were built in this period. The Jeeps, or perhaps M201s, were with the French Army right up until the late 1970s and can still be seen on TV in former French colonies. Finally, the jeepney in the Philippines, like the London cab, is not a military vehicle, but owes its parentage to the wartime Jeep. Today we're seeing the name Jeep being marketed very strongly in Australia, and this time around we find that the manufacturer is Chrysler Corporation, the original makers of the Jeep's big brother, the weapons carrier. And there's a restored example of one of those at the Army Museum in Fremantle. It's ironic that that big company was not remotely interested in the Jeep at the time, but then got involved with them of latter years. Now, Chrysler then a few years ago teamed up with Daimler, so half the company was owned by Daimler or the other way around, I'm not quite sure, and now I just heard recently again that Daimler have pulled out of that enterprise. The Jeep is still there. In fact, the new Wrangler, the 4-door Jeep, I read the other day, is being offered back to the military as a military vehicle, because the big Hummer or Humvee is so big and so expensive to run that possibly we may see the Jeep painted in khaki colour once again. So the circle has gone the full way. And the next slide from there is a civilian Jeep, modified with a wheel on the side and lots of other things. There's one being used as a crane, and their usage was just everywhere. That's about all that one can say. I can answer any questions that you may have. I can see someone hovering behind me here. and there's a photo of various other examples of what the Jeep could do. They had a Rolls-Royce engine, which was apparently without fault, but the rest of it was so complicated that the Australian Army trialled a few, and there's a gentleman just in front of you who would probably remember a little bit about them. They were completely sealed to run underwater with tail shafts and complicated torque tubes and all sorts of things on them. There's one or two who have been restored in the military section of the car club, and they have a lot of trouble with them, even just driving them to and fro on little parades. But if they weren't so complicated, they would have been wonderful. They had also a system of reverse gear, so they could go as fast backwards as forward. I think it was to get out of ambush type situations. But they're not terribly popular for restorers. The Jeep is the one that's sought after. Okay, I think I'll end it at that because time's got on. We've had some interesting speakers today. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation on the vehicle that's been in all three areas, both land, sea and air. I wish you all the compliments of the season, and I look forward to being a passenger for some more enjoyable meetings next year. Thank you.